But one thing that nobody seems to be contesting is that shifts in power are what cause the system to destabilize. Right? So it is either this kind of drift towards hegemony from relatively balanced conditions, right? Or if there is already an evident hegemony in the system, it is other challengers rising up to the hegemon and contesting the system. Right? You can think of that as the United States being challenged by the rising power of China or other actors in the system who are very discontent with their position in the international system, Russia or perhaps Iran, right? And so in transitional, let's say, junctures of that sort, theoretically, it could be either the hegemon taking preventive action to try to thwart any rising opposition to its hegemony, or it could be the opponent starting war to try to claim their share of benefits in the system. Or as I tend to tell to my students in statistics, sometimes there are simultaneity effects, and things happen to be a little bit more multi-causal than it sometimes appears. And of course, we can engage in sort of these varied interpretations of events from our theoretical lens. For instance, defensive realists who pay more attention to balancing against threats rather than balancing against power. They currently seem to be a little bit vindicated that the NATO alliance is reinvigorating as it is facing the Russian threat. But on the other hand, offensive realists are claiming, and they appear to be very confident, that the United States is actually the root cause of the current escalation. It's responsible for what's happening in Ukraine. All right, just to cut it very short, I wanted to perhaps say that these are realistically speaking, or judging from the perspective of the neo-realist school of thought, the current escalation is certainly due to this major power shift happening. And as we can witness, of course, our region is one of the perhaps epicenters of this sort of transformations, where the United States is facing both Russia and Iran in one place, and also, we're also witnessing a lot of regional rivalry trying to claim positions regionally. And perhaps then I should pass the floor to some other colleagues to speak, and we'll come back to theory later on. Okay, thank you.
In a way, we're going to continue in the paradigmatic sort of discussion and transition into the more based on what Roman has told me on this last moment he decided to switch. But this is one of the key things, right? Realism and power relations, and everything seems to be defined by power relations. So let's transition into that. Roman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Asbeth. Thank you, Asbeth. I think Datovic has already essentially begun speaking about one of the prevalent, maybe, analytical frameworks that many of you can observe in consuming daily commentary in whatever media outlet you follow and whatever talking heads you follow. Our task today is, our self-defined task today is to offer you some analytical frameworks to improve our understanding of what is going on from academic, professional standpoint. We are very often being told that we are betrayed, that Datovic was speaking about saviors, etc. We're kind of trying to compete with those narratives by offering these frameworks of analysis. Neo-realists, as Datovic mentioned, basically postulate that states do what they do irrelevant of who their leaders are. And correct me if that's wrong. They're basically blackboxing the state and saying that states and whatever agents operating on their behalf are some generic, rational utility maximizers. That's one very important effort or analytical framework to look inside the black box of what is going on inside the power corridors of modern states. The other framework, the other analytical framework, is offered by a subfield of IR called foreign policy analysis, which even though we're trying to teach in this university, is not very popular in this part of the world, and it's probably more kind of advanced in the United States and some European countries. The basic argument here, maintained by foreign policy and FPA scholars, is that human decision makers are not interchangeable, generic, rational utility maximizers. Who they are, what they believe, and, for example, what roles they claim to be playing in their respective national elites matters a lot, and matters a lot from the perspective of the results that the foreign policy decision-making process in modern countries renders. I'll bring maybe two specific examples in this pitch before we end up discussing among ourselves. Foreign policy scholars in the past few years have come up with a question whether or not populist political leaders can be argued to have some generic shared among themselves approaches of how do they conduct foreign policy, how do they conduct the decision-making processes that yield to certain foreign policy decisions. And by and large, they have concluded that populist leaders in modern states, European countries, modern developing and developed states, are by and large the same, the common denominator being that they subordinate foreign policy to their domestic political needs. They subordinate foreign policy to their electoral periods. You may say, obviously, that this is what you observe in many countries, and United States obviously being probably the most cited example, that there every 2 years, the congressional midterms, every 4 years, the presidential elections define the president's foreign policy. That's not entirely the case. There is big difference between Obama, Trump, and Joe Biden. Foreign policy FPA scholars or foreign policy analysts offer a few more other layers of analysis, but overall they are based on certain actor-specific theory in contrast to IR, in contrast to those very kind of high-level analysis offered by neoliberals, neorealists, realists, and others. Essentially, FPA scholars claim that there is a political process that you have to look at to make evaluations of what foreign policy choices are being made. They argue that foreign policy choices depend on political process. In other words, foreign policy choices are made in most of the cases in modern states, whether democratic or authoritarian, by the way, almost the same, almost. They're made by small groups. What are the dynamics between this, between and among these people who sit in these small groups, or most generically national security councils? What is the power dynamic? What does the process look like? How do leaders structure these decision-making processes in these small groups? How they structure the decision-making process has very, very big effect on the outcome of this political process that ends up in foreign policy decisions. But I'll probably stop here and we'll continue discussing by essentially offering a few analytical frameworks of interpreting what is going on inside the black boxes, arguing that we can have a look into it.
Yeah, it just dawned on me that the way the panel is structured, and I apologize, I'm sometimes slow, but it really fits into our new degree, International Relations and Diplomacy, in a sense that we're putting the framework or the framework of analysis within IR and diplomacy as the tool used to do that. And I think both Varam and Arsen are going to be talking about that. But one quick point, I think a couple of words need to be sort of repeated in our mind: utilitarian foreign policy. Which, if you were to take borrow from architecture, form follows function, a 19th century idea that most people are interested in developing structure, not as functionally, thinking about it functionally, but formally. While others would say, no, if you actually think about the function, the form will follow. And I think this also can be held true in terms of foreign policy to some extent, leading into what I hope Varam will be touching upon. Varam?
Thank you. I just want to remind everyone that last year, exactly on this day, we had a meeting here, exactly in this room, talking about the Ukrainian war, which we planned a few days before the event, but we of course didn't know that what Putin had in mind in the morning of February 24th. And actually the entire idea of having this discussion was exactly that, to discuss what happened over the last year and what are the implications of this war on Armenia. But then Oman has decided that let's propose that let's talk about this issue because it's much pertinent to our discussions and debates that we are having. So what I want to do in the minute that Asbeth allowed us to speak is to talk about two things. First is how notions of alliance and partners have been formed in Armenia and what were the historical context of this. So sometimes we forget about that and we jump into conclusions only having the recent experience, the recent political and historical developments. And second, what I want us to always look at the bigger context, how in Armenia's political discourse, Armenia's closest neighbors, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Georgia, and Iran, are always seen outside of Armenia's regionalism, Armenia's notions of regionalism. So this year, when I taught Armenian politics course, I asked my students. We did an exercise. The exercise was the following. So imagine you go to bed on September 30th of 1828, and then you wake up today, February 24th of 2023. What would you discover? How would you imagine your surroundings? What would have changed if you were the same person in the same context? Of course, that person would wake up in a completely different environment, in a completely different setting, in a completely different cultural, ideological, and political context. And why I want to stress that day, of course, those who took the course, they know that the next day, the Yerevan castle was occupied by the Russians, and the entire history of the Armenian nation has changed since that date. And the Russia-centric notions of history and geopolitics started to form Armenia's understanding of regionalism, of identity, and for the next 200 years until nowadays, this notion of Russia-centric perception of regionalism, partners, and alliance are still dominating Armenia's political thinking, and for some, they will be forming for some time to come. So there is a great logical fallacy in this. The first is binary terms, thinking of the region and regional politics in binary terms, and mechanistic determinism. These are two terms I want us to explore today. What does a binary fallacy entail? It basically means that if it's not A, then it is B. What is mechanistic determinism entail is that if it's not A, then it's B and only B. So Armenia's understanding of regionalism and its place in the region has been mostly in these binary terms, moving more towards binary understanding of friends and foes, and a mechanistic determinism that it's only Russia and nothing else than Russia. So this idea has been challenged in the years of independence from 1988 to 1991, when a few scholars or quasi-scholars came forward and challenged openly this notion of understanding Armenia and Armenia's place in the region. But that tradition discontinued as Armenia found itself in the war in the 1990s. Now we are back to square one on many terms, and the 2020 war once again showed us the importance and that we have to go back sometimes to the history, to the foundations of conceptualizations of how we define ourselves in this region. The South Caucasian geopolitical equation is still in the making. It's still, there are a number of axes that have been formed: Turkish-Russian, Turkish-Azerbaijani, Russian-Iranian. But in this equation, Armenia thinks of this equation along the 19th century mentality. It is still very much Russia-oriented. From time to time, we see what I call Israel-Ori pattern emerging, going to Europe, asking for help, that will come and help us. But this is, again, a dangerous pattern of thinking that comes back from time to time and dominates the thinking of political debate and discourse and narratives in Armenia. So we have to, Armenia's political elite has to get rid of that kind of thinking, and Armenia's intellectuals have a great job to do in this regard, because being trapped in that mentality of going over our immediate neighbors, finding our allies and partners somewhere out there is something that is being challenged again and again over the past 200 years. I'll stop here.
Thank you a lot, Varam. I mean, you raised very, very good points in the Armenian context that are important to keep in mind while thinking about it. The lexicon is one of the biggest problems in terms of describing issues. We tend to explain the world now as if we're using lexicon from the Cold War, and that limits to a large extent our understanding of issues as well. And the historical precedents, I think it renews itself, not in a good way. To some extent, it's mostly because you do not have, or Armenia did not have, foreign policy experience, so they would rely on history, and they would make decisions based on history, which is not always the best outcome, rather than being pragmatic, a word that was also used. And before giving the mic to Arsen, who has been waiting very patiently, one of the things I think, for me, it's always mind-boggling to look at Armenian foreign policy thought or political thought in the late 1980s, where ideas such as the law to exclude third force were more pragmatic, but also thinking about more active, proactive foreign policy, instead of developing and being entrenched more, has actually lost more and more, and history took over by relying on a Russia-centric approach. So Arsen, thanks for your patience. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon. The new balance of power, actually the balance of power in our region before the war was disadvantageous for Armenia. This new balance of power and diplomatic environment are even more unfavorable for both Armenia and Artsakh, especially after the Second Artsakh War. Armenian foreign policy needs to have a new concept. And that concept should have a substance and content, as it used to have during the tenure of the first and second presidents of Armenia. And it's great aspect that you mentioned, the law of excluding the third force, because many generations in Armenia, they have shaped their minds reading those articles published after 1988. So this new concept for the foreign policy of Armenia should take into account the interaction of political and economic affairs. And given the problems we have in Armenia, including high rate of unemployment, uneven distribution of wealth, poverty, inequality, and all other problems, this concept should include, first of all, the economization of the Armenian foreign policy. We have to develop economic diplomacy. Besides the economization of our foreign policy, the self-determination of Artsakh should be the major part of our foreign policy. We cannot buy those formulations like freedoms and security for the people of Artsakh. It has to be self-determination, and the status of Artsakh should be based on the self-determination of the Armenians who live there. This new concept also should revise our relations with major power centers, such as Russia, the United States, China, the European Union. And of course, we have to improve our relations with diaspora, because after the Second Artsakh War, I can see that these relations has been changed. I mentioned some of the problems of our society and foreign policy, and I think one of the main causes of this is bad education in Armenia and decline of international studies. So thank you. I think I will finish here and we can continue.
Thanks a lot, Arsene. I think all four speakers raised quite interesting thoughts, and I was thinking, how are we going to fill 2 hours? Now I'm worried that 2 hours will not be enough for this discussion, but well, I wasn't worried. I have complete trust in my colleagues. But let me pose some questions for us to discuss collectively. And again, it's an open discussion. In terms of the do or die kind of a situation, which realism and neorealism creates, what opportunities do you think it would be possible, and what mechanisms would a country like Armenia, and I'm not saying poor Armenia kind of, my dissertation was on small states, and even small states have opportunities, they create opportunities. But having in mind the neorealist dominant paradigm, let's say, what opportunities can Armenia concretely utilize? What tools can Armenia utilize to do what some of our speakers mentioned, specifically both Baram and Arsene, in terms of changing the mindset, but also focusing on defining new relations with neighbors and non-neighbors. So is there any paradigmatic sort of approach that can Armenia start thinking, or can scholars use to explain or guide? Any thoughts?
It's a great question. Well, I perceive my role in this panel as kind of taking a very long step back from whatever preferences we may have, from the east to west or north to south, and trying to, and to try to see what the various theoretical paradigms are offering. In that regard, I did choose to focus on the neorealist paradigm. And neorealism, interestingly, according to its founder, Kenneth Waltz, is not a theory about foreign policy. It is a very broad systemic theory. And so it does not really explain a state behavior in terms of their foreign policies. However, it does give you some sort of broader contextual understanding of processes or things. I think that the main asset in kind of relying on, or not necessarily relying, but at least making sure that you're not ignoring our politics at play is the key benefit offered from the school of neorealism. We are, for instance, I don't want to say that this is the only, of course, paradigm that organizers are thinking. There are a few other paradigms who have been contesting along the concepts of neorealism, one being neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, of course, does not deny compromise, but it does pay closer attention to other important concepts. In this context, for instance, it would not necessarily see this a power competition only, but also, let's say, an opposition between liberal democracy versus authoritarian regimes, right? And there's a lot of that conversation that we're hearing in various contexts. That there isn't a liberal tide, so to say, in the world that America is intent on reversing, as it has done previously in history. That this is not just a battle of East and West, and if you have been following the Munich Security Conference recently, the language was exactly, following that, that pattern that this isn't an East to West confrontation. This is a confrontation between the rule of law and the rule of the powerful. Right, I think when President Biden came into office, he organized that summit of democracy. A year later, NATO's strategic concept was approved, which clearly, again, defined authoritarian states as being key threats to the Western liberal democracy, the democratic way of thinking. I think a great example of that is also Nancy Pelosi's recent visit to Armenia, where she kind of, placed again that, dichotomy of being, we were facing a choice between democracy and autocracy, and we have to absolutely choose democracy. And the world from Ukraine to Taiwan to Armenia, is one of her words, are facing a choice like that. So there is a lot of, alternative thinking to our politics.
Sorry to interrupt you, but on this, as you were talking, I'd like to get Arsen's opinion about this, especially the idea in terms of the context of what you were saying about economization of foreign policy, and how eventually that also has an impact on the binary choices that or the lack of, or breaking the binary choices. I think it would be quite interesting to comment in a way on what you're saying, but it's an idea that Arsen mentioned, but he didn't dwell a bit more on it. Is it possible to have that, what you're saying, economization of Armenia's foreign policy in an environment that Tadevik is mentioning in terms of a neo-realist or realist world, and or should there be other opportunities to sort of explore?
Sure, we can do that. Actually, the standard component of hardline mythologies we have in our country is the rejection of materialism, realism, and strategic thinking. I think we have to bring back materialism, realism, and strategic thinking in our foreign policy. And when it comes to the economization of the foreign policy, of course, we need also in this country to do some structural changes, because I don't think to have only Ministry for Foreign Affairs works effectively now. It can be Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. And this is not something new, because like many countries, they have this institution. And when you look at the list of trade representatives of Armenia, they all under the Ministry of Economy. And you see that these people also, when you do some research and get to their background, you see that these people, majority of these people, are there only to have license plates with diplomatic numbers and cover their businesses. We need to have professionals, diplomats, with economic background who can serve as trade representatives of Armenia. Together with embassies and ambassadors, can also have an impact of foreign trade balance. With the majority of countries, we have negative trade balance. That would be very helpful, number one, to have the structural change. And number two, of course, we need a concept. concept for that since, like, I would always give this example of the US foreign policy, a containment policy. Containment was a content of the foreign policy, or even isolation. But you cannot have a foreign policy without content, without substance. But currently we do, and it's all about like visits back and forth without any content and substance. And I think given all these economic problems we have in our country, the economization of our foreign policy with the structural changes should be pretty effective.
And thank you, Arsen. Vanessa, I will come back to you in a moment. But Vadam, what about the idea that you mentioned in terms of the dualities and the binary in terms of West or Russia? Is that something that, is there room to maneuver in the context that, I mean, at this point, we're all assuming that we're operating in a neorealist context. I mean, feel free, anyone, any of the panelists to challenge that. But what are your thoughts about that, Vadam?
So when I was talking about this binary policy, or binary terms of geopolitics, I couldn't finish my sentence, but that was the following, that thinking along these lines for a country like Armenia is simplistic, inappropriate, and dangerous. They have implications, and they have been having implications for many, many years. So when we, this pattern, this kind of thinking was not there until, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, Armenian foreign policy was exactly thinking outside of the binary policy, outside of the black box. And I keep saying that Arsen is here, the diplomat, serving the foreign ministry for many years in the 1990s. I think what Armenian diplomats did in the 1990s later on should be written with great pride in the history of our nation. Because out of uncertainty, they have created a history that would make any nation so proud of its history. I mean, let's say in 1993, there were 4 security resolutions of the UN Security Council. I mean, for many years, Azerbaijan has successfully have been pushing its own interpretation so successfully that even members of our Armenian parliament have been referring to the Azerbaijani interpretation of UN Security Council resolutions, 4 resolutions, without even reading the original UN Security Council resolutions. And I had that question asked many members of the parliament, even politicians. Did you or did you not read the UN Security Council resolution when you're making the statement, repeating the Azerbaijani interpretations? So why I'm saying this, because what Armenian diplomats did in 1993 in New York was a prime example of excellence and hard work and perseverance, and knowing that it's because of thinking outside of the box, outside of this binary policy, that they could achieve what they achieved in 1993. And this, I remember Ruben Shagarian on the talented Armenian diplomat, he has published a wonderful article in the 1990s in Armenian International Magazine, and saying basically the following, that a journalist asks him, when you were born, Mr. Shagarian, Mr. Ambassador, was Armenia's first ambassador to the United States, he says, it doesn't matter when I was born, everybody after 1988 was born exactly on 1988 because it was a new beginning. He said, I was appointed Armenia's ambassador to Washington with no diplomatic skills, but we had to do miracles. And we arrived in Washington with one mission in mind, to do impossible, and we did the impossible. And but things have changed in the 1990s, in the second half of the 90s, with domestic ills, with institutional problems, and we started to have one problem after another. So I think that from 1988 to 1994, Armenia demonstrated that thinking outside of binary policy. But what happened in Lisbon in 1986 came to show that if you are not following the principles of this thinking of outside of binary policy, you are going to in 1886 showed that we need some space from 1884 to 1886, and that some of these patterns continue to now.
Thank you, Vadim. It's quite interesting that in our mind, and I completely share your sentiments, with the caveat that we also have to realize that Armenia's success in the early 90s was also conditioned by the environment at the time, the international environment with Russia still trying in transition and so on. But I completely agree that that was that period of the golden age, if you want to call it, of Armenia's diplomacy. But at the same time, it is important to keep in mind the domestic constraints that also Hovannes mentioned, and also not being a one-hit wonder kind of a diplomacy, right? Just because you were great in a certain period of time, that doesn't mean that what you use will work in other places. You need to also constantly renovate, invent, recycle, even sometimes ideas to adapt to the changing environment. Hovannes, what are your thoughts about what we've been talking so far?
Vadim reminded me of this difficulty that I was experiencing maybe 10 years ago or more in trying to convince some of our diplomats and others in the leadership that it makes a lot of sense to at least reading those resolutions of 1993, and they're very short, around 2 pages each. One of them is a little bit more, but it's basically not a long. You shouldn't be frightened. You shouldn't be afraid of reading those and maybe utilizing some of the achievements that the diplomats have really secured back in, I should say, 1992-94, if we want to capture the entire process going on in the UN Security Council, which, by the way, we initiated ourselves. Armenia initiated these discussions on issues. The agenda item, the title was issue related to Nagorno-Karabakh. In May, with a letter of the president, Arsen may remember it, with a letter from the president, I think dated May 1992, to request the Security Council consideration of this subject matter. But this brings me to challenging, basically, not basically challenging maybe, but offering some extra lens of analysis aspect to what you were referring to by mentioning environment. Environment is important, and IR theories underline the importance of the environment, but it will be counterintuitive, if not misleading, to argue that any other leader of Armenia of 1990s would have done what has been done. The same goes true about later stages. Maybe the second period when Armenia's foreign policy making was producing good results is probably 2005, 2011, when the Madrid principles were beginning to be negotiated, with a culmination in November 2007, and then Armenia-Turkey process that started 2008, that was publicized in 2008 and all the way to 2011 Kazan summit in June. So these periods were marked by strong leadership, not just by the environment. If we only consider the environment, which is maybe conducive, maybe not conducive, we may be missing some of the important aspects of our analysis. And I think leadership has to be probably underlined very much here. This is where the explanatory power of IR theories is a little bit weak to interpret the whole multidimensional nature of the world we're living in. We were speaking about neoliberals a few moments ago. Neoliberal assumptions are being proven to be wrong if you, for example, take Germany's shift in this Ukraine war period from being more or less neutral and now delivering these tanks and other ammunition to Germany. Had neoliberal paradigm been true, Germany, so reliant on Russian gas and other businesses, would not have done it. And then this is one. Second, this human rights, democracy, etc. I mean, I understand this is very fashionable to be talking about that, but had the world been so binary, to borrow Varlam's word, between authoritarian and democratic regimes, we would not be probably living in through the 75th day, I think, of the siege of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is human rights issue, right? Which is a human rights issue. This is not a world. This is not a competition between authoritarian and democratic regimes. Had it been so, Aliyev would not be so embraced in the Munich Security Conference with all the things he was saying and doing there. This is more complicated. It is much more complicated, which makes more sense to maybe drag in some terms borrowed from FPA, from foreign policy analysis, such as image theory, for example. How do the leaders that we are talking about, how do they see their respective roles vis-a-vis their own countries and vis-a-vis their regions? I think Russian Kommersant published maybe yesterday or the day before an article with some sources, as they normally do, a very good article, where Lavrov, the incumbent foreign minister of Russia, the longtime foreign minister of Russia, was being cited in response to a question of who have been the advisors of Putin to launch this invasion. He said, metaphorically, obviously, he said his advisors were Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. Sure, we cannot know, as you said, Varam, what was going on in Putin's head the day before, this invasion exactly a year ago. But there are both domestic and internal and external, factors to consider to improve our explanatory potential or potential for our better understanding of what is going on and how to interpret this. And there are, so many different sources to do that. As you said, Asfed, this is exactly where the process determines the outcome. And we have to pay a closer look into how the decision-making processes in the countries that we are talking about structured to better explain, better understand, and better predict what is going to be the course of action that we will face. Thank you.
I want to move a bit. Again, you guys can always participate and finish up some of the ideas that I didn't have a chance. But if we were looking at IR as an environment and foreign policy as a sort of a goal, obviously diplomacy is a tool, tactical, but also strategic. In this context that we have been establishing in the last hour or so, what is the biggest challenge, in your opinion, and again, open up for anyone who wants to go first, for Armenia to have a diplomacy or to conduct a diplomacy, putting aside that there is or there isn't a foreign policy priority, which I have already addressed, but for diplomatically as a tool, what is that we see missing? Is it an issue of continuity? Is it an issue of thinking outside the box? Is it an issue of not having enough diplomats in the right places, or what? What is it that we're missing, if we're missing anything?
Of course, this question has to be discussed, and some observations that are made in one of my articles published in Circle of Quarterly in 2021, where we analyze Armenia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the last 13 years. So in that article published in one of the reputable journals in our field, I wrote a conclusion, and the editor asked me to. So the conclusion was that there are some right indication that the current government of Nikol Pashinyan is moving to the right direction by appointing only Korean diplomats to the ambassadorial position. So he sent it back, the editor, saying, Goran, this looks, would you please revise the sentence? And by the time I was revising and sending it back, the current ambassador to the United States just was appointed. So when Ambassador Makuns was appointed and she became Armenia's ambassador to the United States, I understood that we are seeing a paradigm shift. We are seeing that even though the current prime minister, he pledged to follow what he pledged, like follow the pattern of appointing Korean diplomats to ambassadorial positions, he moved away from that decision. So what were the reasons that he did that? I think there were a number of issues, but one of them was, of course, being disappointed in some of the deliverables that the foreign ministry and the officials, ambassadors in our embassies abroad have been failing to deliver over the many years since 2018. The second, I guess, there are institutional structural issues within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Look at the number of job announcements that currently Ministry of Foreign Affairs has. Never before the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has so many job openings. Right now, when you go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, you will find many job openings, and I can guarantee you our graduates can easily get into that and become diplomats. Something that you do mention in your statement of purpose when you apply to become a student, a PSI student. So by the time you graduate, you're not going there. So what's the reason? Why? I have to tell you that the government has doubled the salary. Now, instead of 80,000 since January 1st, it's 160,000 for attaché. So something to think about. It's a great career, full of adventures, full of discoveries, and full of learning curve. So why young people are not going there? It's not a rhetorical question. So how many of you are willing to consider opening the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and become a diplomat? Please raise your hand.
And considering that just 2 days ago I sent an email with 19 jobs at the
So I don't see a single hand, and that's a matter of concern. And to think about also for us, as we are thinking of moving to creating a Master of Arts of International Relations and Diplomacy, perhaps it's something that we have to think very seriously, because down the road, this can become diplomatic academy, diplomatic school, and this is what we are aiming for with the great plan that we have put together with the faculty, and these can become really one of the places that our future diplomats will be trained. The second issue I think has to do with the fact that in the streets I see many Armenian former diplomats, deputy foreign ministers, heads of departments, ministers of foreign affairs, former foreign ministers of affairs, and they don't have a job. Well, you can say that they left their positions because of political reasons or they were fired, but a country like Armenia cannot afford letting diplomats with 30 years of experience just go out and without having a say, without having any say, even in the diplomatic school. In the US, you finish your public service, immediately you'll go to the academia and back and forth. This is a power of the US system. And for instance, Arsen, a Korean diplomat, he left in the 1990s. And of course, he came back in 2018 to become advisor. But again, we are seeing some structural issues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we have to also be open and be critical about some of the issues that we see as scholars and address and discuss some of these issues. For instance, before 2018-17, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was having almost monthly meetings with scholars and experts and on Turkey that I was present, and we're discussing issues. Not necessarily our advice was taken into account, but we were informed, and Hrant was also there on many occasions. I remember, but it's just not happening since 2020. I mean, last time I was at the Foreign Ministry was 2 weeks before the war. So why that has changed? We never had a chance to ask these questions to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Anyone wants to add anything about the diplomacy or the strategy, diplomatic strategy? Well, yeah, Marcin, of course.
Okay, well, I'm absolutely right that Armenia cannot afford to have like 15, 20 high-ranking diplomats who left the foreign ministry after the Second Artsakh War. Just for very simple reasons. Number one, these guys worked from attaché and they later became extraordinary ambassadors of Armenia. That's an experience of 25, 30 years, of course. And that's our tradition, Armenia's diplomatic tradition, because we do not have diplomatic traditions as our neighbors, let's say Turkey or Iran, right? They have diplomatic traditions of centuries. These 30 years of independence was our diplomatic tradition. And also, if you calculate how much the state invested into these guys for 30 years, their salaries, all this compensation, their work abroad, many of them served as Armenian ambassadors abroad. Like, you can ask the same question as what if 10, 15 generals leave your army? What, you're going to leave them and say, okay, you're leaving the army without even taking into account the access to information they had. So, but unfortunately, that's our reality, and those diplomats and many other servicemen are out of the system. I mentioned in my introductory remarks about bad education and decline of international studies in Armenia. I think this university can play a major role to change this situation. Look, the rise of the United States as a global power was the product of economic and military advantages, and also of unmatched knowledge of the hidden interior of other nations, their languages and cultures, their economies and geographies, their histories and political systems. And I think that knowledge flourished in an environment defined by some of the great innovations of American higher education. That's unfettered inquiry, number one, the assessment of scholarship via rigorous peer review, and the link between original teaching and between original research and innovative teaching. So international affairs, education, international affairs, and research are also part of countries' domestic life. Democratic societies depend on having a cadre of informed professionals outside of the government, including, people in universities, think tanks, museums, research institutions, who cultivate expertise protected from the pressure of the state. And all this points to just how important international and regional studies can be when they are adequately funded, publicly valued, and shielded from the exigencies of national security. And when I said bad education, like, for example, like within last 10, 15 years, I couldn't see any studies about the relationship between Russia and Turkey, about the relationship between Russia and Azerbaijan, because this relationship has changed. Many things changed in the bilateral ties between Russia and Turkey and Russia and Azerbaijan. And our foreign policy didn't have anything to offer and to have a flexible position in our regional policies. And I think we should look at our neighbors and other countries, their pasts and presents, their myths and worldviews with sympathetic curiosity. Maintaining the ability to do so is not only our insurance policy for the future, it is also the essence of open and critical society. And that's why I think this university can play a major role in all these dimensions.
2 points both Varam and Arsen actually raised, without actually using the word, but the issue of institutional memory is very, very important in any context. But also with Varam's sort of playing devil's advocate and asking how many of you are thinking of doing it, it also expresses the idea of being a service, public service, being public servants, right? Basically something that not a lot of people think about going into public service, be that in diplomacy, in foreign policy, but also within the country. The idea of, as much as corny as it would sound, but what Kennedy has mentioned, in terms of don't ask what the country can do for you and so on and so forth. It always irks me to say that, but I mean the guy had control. I mean he monopolized the prose. But it is an issue of public service, but also how to utilize and understanding that public service is beyond politics. And it actually creates an opportunity for people to learn from each other. Jovanes or Daterik, do you have any comments about the issue of diplomacy? Then I would like to open the floor for some questions and then more discussion.
I would probably refrain from commenting on what is going on with our diplomacy because I frankly don't have too much information about that, but I do concur for sure on the importance of institutional memory, on the importance of professional appointments. There's little argument that against those claims. There certainly is. I think that this is a luxury that we cannot afford for sure. A small country like Armenia, who does not really have the capacity, the professional capacity that it requires to meet the extraordinary challenges of our time. It is kind of a little bit unthinkable that this is actually happening. But like I said, I don't really know what's exactly happening inside. But I think what I want to say though, perhaps maybe developing on Jovanes' idea about neoliberalism and failing to demonstrate that it has explanatory power. I think I want to actually, not a direct quote, but this is a response from Michael Dash a few decades ago, probably. I think he placed it the best in the theoretical context. Is that there's nothing, there's nothing certainly wrong with ideas and culturalism and institutions, and certainly they do play a role, right? There's nobody is questioning that ideas and ideals and institutions are important. The question, though, is how much independent explanatory power they have from power politics, as in comparison to power politics. And there it is when we're witnessing that their explanatory power is not necessarily independent of power politics, right? It is when the ideologies or the ideas are meeting the strategic interest, it is there that we see that they are so much more effectively being employed. And then wherever they're not necessarily meeting the power interests, they're being undermined. So theoretically, I do agree that that kind of debate has not produced a good outcome for neoliberalism. And that in turn, I think, would be a good advice for diplomacy as well, because I think it seems at times that our diplomatic effort is a little bit misguided because it seems that as it pursues certain ideological perspectives without considering where that has, where theory has led us to this point. So it seems like there is a lacking comprehensive assessment of how theory can really help us rather than put us in vulnerable positions like this.
I love this. I think this is really doing its job, looking and helping our improve our understanding. Three very brief comments before our friends in the audience think about their questions, which I hope there will be. I think these material and ideational factors that we're talking about really, be that materialism, realism, neoliberalism, whatever, their point of intersection is really not the state. Human decision makers are. Which brings me back to this leadership issue. That I'm a big believer in that. Since that improves our understanding beyond the paradigms, beyond the theories, really. For example, I mean, I think we agree that neorealism, explains a lot more now, right? That's what Mersheimer has used to explain Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Fair enough, but if we bring that to our region, one of the main pillars of neorealist approach, the concept of balance of power, the importance of the balance of power, is being completely, you're asking about tools aspect, something that is being completely abandoned in the elite discourse in Armenia, vis-a-vis whether we have friends or foes, in both peace and war. And what is this important leadership issue? Which is what I would connect to Varam's question to our fellow students, if anyone is planning a career in public service, be that public service or diplomatic service. Well, maybe that's also a leadership issue. That's a conceptual, philosophical issue. Right? The current research in why people leave their jobs, especially after this crisis in COVID, etc. Why do they leave their well-paid jobs in big corporations? It's not money. They are in search of meaning. They do not either want or do not want to be part of the bigger idea that the big corporation is serving. Same reason is why so many diplomats have left the foreign ministry. And if that's the reason, then I mean it's almost counterintuitive to kind of expect students be applying to the jobs that they see they're more qualified, more experienced is the word. People are living that. Maybe we have to first develop this narrative, develop the conceptual approach that Arsen was speaking about, for that to be attractive for the students, to be really interested in pursuing that type of career. Things have changed, and I think we're in agreement in here. And we have not seen this change being reflected in publications, being reflected in the thinking of the elites about the foreign policy choices in Armenia. And probably, I mean, not to make this argument in abstract, a good example, a good reference point of this is the national security strategy paper published 2 days before the escalation in Tavush in 2020, which was something, I mean, if you look into it today, that is something completely misreading of where the world has taken us as of summer 2020 and where we're now. So I can go on and on and explain why this happened, but probably the key word here is groupthink. This all happens when this political process or the policy-making process in general, proceeds in an environment where the consensus is being prioritized over decisions, which is leading to suboptimal outcomes.
Thank you all. Really, I mean, this discussion is becoming quite invigorating. Couple of quick comments or statements. One thing to keep in mind is that the institution is shaped by the person as much as the person is shaped by the institution, especially in environments in diplomacy in the early years in countries that do not have well-structured institutions. Interestingly, very interestingly, when Arsen was talking about the diplomacy tradition in Turkey, in Iran, and so on. I've had experiences where being in a room, in a conference, and then someone would walk in any of the countries without getting names, and I would tell that this person is a diplomat, just by the gravitas or the way they hold, and that is part of the tradition as well. Something that doesn't necessarily work in all environments. So, any questions, comments, concerns, curses, or tomato? Yes, Dr.
Thank you very much. I feel very privileged to be here and to listen to this discourse. My question is, what do we do in opening this discourse, the questions you challenge they raise for wider audiences? Because what do we do in opening a discourse with questions you raised today with a wider audience, into an audience that is used to populism, myths, and is still suffering with trivial discourses of Nakin I'm sorry, So do you see your role in that to open discussions for wider audience? I come from Lori, and that's just the perspective that I bring here, because I'm pretty sure if we would put online this discourse, we would have like 100 views or something, because people are not interested, and I think it's our role to engage people into these discourses and make them care. And another question is, you may answer or not, is related to our diaspora. We slightly, I think Professor Gasparian mentioned the role of our diaspora. What are we doing wrong in engaging them? Because I think they can have a tremendous role for both foreign politics and domestic politics as well. Thank you very much. I hope I did not. Thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
Don't worry. So the first question about our role here in terms of the discourse, raising the discourse to talk about these questions about what are the foreign policy. Anyone wants to take it?
If you don't mind, I'll take it.
You were too
Thank
eager
you.
to take it.
Thank you. Unless
Hey, go ahead. Everyone
thank you
has
for
a chance.
raising it. I was hoping that this question will be raised. Tatevik, right? Yeah. Two answers. Okay. First, it is really the job of academic and professional expert communities to be contributing to such discourses and creating such discourses, informing the wider public. And this is especially important and a big responsibility really in any representative system, okay? Where you do not expect everyone to be informed of everything, be that in Lori, Yerevan, or elsewhere. Of course, if we want to build such a representative system. But it's also not fair to say that this such discussions are not going on in the country. Today and yesterday, I counted four, ours being the fourth, professional discussions with very experienced people with a good track record, not just talking heads, okay? With a good list of panelists, so to say, how to make the society more, informed, engaged, etc. I don't know, but again, Tatevik would love now. This again, leads me to this leadership issue. But probably the peel that I have concluded for myself that we need is called trust. Right? society has to be built on trust. You're talking about populism anywhere you look at, be that Hungary, Poland, and Armenia, United States, anywhere, right, where this disease has been spread in the past few years, you have a certain decline of trust between the general public and their respective government. And this has really torn apart the social fabric in these societies. The trust between the citizens and the academic, expert communities, etc., is really the peel that we have to reinvent, sort of, to engage in a broader public discourse. And how to do that, I have no idea in a world where everyone claims to be a big expert in their social networks, etc., which has created these silos, which has created these social bubbles that we're all in. But if we, step back for a second and rethink what trust means for us, right? That I think will at least begin, resolving this big nightmare we're in.
Yes, Bob.
Sorry.
My colleague Roman is very humble to mention one very important thing. So on Saturday, there was a big event in the country. That was a book fest, so one of the books was the test of expertise that Roman Stigovic, our dear colleague, has translated into Armenian. So we'll be having an event soon, and it's about that. Reading that book will answer your questions. And actually, that book was a required reading for our students before they came to the first class of PSA course. The first class of the they have to read that before entering the first class. The English version. No. So soon there will be this book launch. What happened on Saturday it was more marketing rather than proper discussion of the problem. So hopefully there will be some interesting discussion in the coming days. And the book of Johannes that he translated from Tom Nichols will be presented. So I also forgot to mention his first book that he translated called Populism of Jan Muller. So again, I'm promoting you. Come on. So, I like it. So I really encourage you to read that. Of course, your English is great, but just in case of if you want to popularize some of the ideas. But back to your question, it was much more fundamental. What is happening now is vulgarization of opinion making in the country. And many scholars and opinion makers have withdrawn from the public domain. And basically you are saying these are interesting discussions, why you are not going to the wider public. If you look there, there's a camera over there, and the camera is supposed to capture, no, not only it's video camera, so we are going to upload this. Just come back and see how many views we have. Yes, so you are absolutely right. So because some of the scholars, some of the opinion makers have withdrawn themselves from the public domain, it's always difficult to find the ways of how to enter in a way that whatever we say and do is meaningful. In the era of populism and test of expertise, this great comeback will never happen the way we imagine. We'll be thinking of different ways of engaging with the public discourse and trying to reshape it. And I take your question as an urge for us to think differently. Thank you.
Before I give the floor to Arsen to talk about the specific question about the diaspora, also on this, one thing I would challenge your question, the premise of your question is, should foreign policy making be democracy or democratized? Do we need to conduct a foreign policy based on what everyone thinks? Or it is based on expert knowledge and so on? If we change that question, the whole discussion would change, but also in terms of again, changing it back a bit, the answer is that both Hovannes and Baram provided in terms of you need to inform, you need to educate, you need to raise the discourse. Oh yeah, I'm talking too much. Go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, yes, I mentioned that the improvement of our relations with diaspora should be a part of our new foreign policy concept. Many of my friends from different countries, Armenians from the United States, France, England, and many other countries, changed their position towards Armenia and Artsakh after this war. And I had many open discussions with them. Basically, to cut the long story short, their point of view is the following: that Artsakh has been given to Russia. Russian peacekeepers protect Armenians who live there. Russian peacekeepers ensure the security guarantees for them. It means Armenia and Armenians, Armenia and diaspora, we don't have any role to play there. And they also have serious difficulties to deal with the current government. I think recently there was a big gathering on cooperation between Armenia and diaspora, and people who took part there, they told me that there was no one from the Armenian church, no one from the Armenian Apostolic Church, no one from Armenian Catholic Church, no Armenian Protestants, and also the major Armenian organizations from diaspora didn't take part in the gathering. So in order to understand this, one has to examine aspects of revolutionary politics. And unfortunately, political science is not enough to examine these aspects. You have to also study psychology. I can mention four aspects and features of revolutionary politics, and it's really hard for our compatriots abroad, for Armenian diaspora and organizations to deal with this. It's also not easy for foreign countries and their leaders to deal with that. So the first and most obvious feature of revolutionary politics is its radicalism. This is number one. Number two, revolutionary politics, they select highly risk-tolerant individuals. The majority of all revolutions and revolutionary movements, they fail, right? So, and therefore one has to be highly risk-tolerant to dedicate the life to something that has such low probability of success. This is the second feature. So another pathology characterizing many revolutionaries, although not all of them, because I cannot, for example, consider Vladimir Lenin in this feature, there is this well-known Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning-Kruger effect, there are two great American scholars, David Dunning and Justin Kruger, who wrote their seminal paper. I can't remember the title of the article, but I can find it for you. And they published it in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. They claim that many revolutionaries are intellectually ambitious but poorly educated and lacking useful experience in government. They learn most of what they know as part of their political struggle in seminars and conversations involving like-minded. And people lacking sophisticated understanding of politics and social reality are particularly prone to vulgarized conceptions of free will, which means materialism, realism, and strategic thinking we just discussed, they're not there. Another feature, it's called in psychology Cassandra complex. You know, in Greek mythology, there was this Cassandra who was, I think, Trojan priestess, and that indicates in modern psychology that person whose accurate prophecies, impending disaster, are not believed. It's a psychological phenomenon. in which professionals and experts accurate and reasonable predictions of a crisis are dismissed or ignored. So the combination of all these pathologies become lethal when revolutionary succeeds. Success serves as a confirmation of revolutionaries' beliefs and attitudes. And successful revolutionary leaders become overconfident in their views and decisions. More dangerously, their followers and supporters start believe in some kind of, messianic figures, right? And and they become messianic figures in the eyes of their followers. And they also begin to believe in their mystical and messianic abilities. So how these Armenian diaspora and foreign leaders should, take into account all these dealing with Armenians. So trust me, it's very difficult.
You know that famous saying that I don't have a God complex, I am God. But again, in terms of question, Hago Ped raised his hand, but anyone else who wants to ask a question, is that we have to also make a distinction between Armenia's foreign policy and Armenian foreign policy. This is where diasporic groups usually have I'm not talking about Armenian case. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of research on this in terms of sometimes non-complementarism. Diaspora is expecting something, whereas the state interest being something else. National versus state interest. Oh, is there? Oh,
thank you very much. You've discussed IR theories much today, especially neorealism, which says, as you mentioned, that state's position in the system is entirely defined by the power distributed to them by the system. If I'm not mistaken, if we bring this argument into the context of Armenia, how we can define Armenia's position in the system? Or in other words, how much is Armenia's relative power? I'm asking this question because there's discourse in the media and in politics in general that we have no power. We are defeated and we should bear the consequences of the defeat, face them and admit them. So what's your position on this question?
Just to maximize it, I think I would give this question to Daterik, but let me get another question. Maybe there might be some combination.
I guess my question was a bit similar.
You have something there. Do you have a pacemaker or something? Just shout it out.
There is a common belief when discussing like foreign policy with my peers, for example, is that the Armenian foreign policy has extremely limited flexibility, especially compared to our neighboring countries, due to our own internal and domestic problems, such as military production means, etc. And it is, I guess, a little bit of a pessimistic belief, but there is some ground to it in a sense that it raises a question of, does Armenia really make choices in foreign policy, or are we just getting dictated by foreign agents which are much powerful than we are, and we're kind of depending on them? So how much, based on everything that we know, how much do you think we have flexibility in our foreign policy, and what are our capabilities?
Great. I'll start with Daterik, if possible, to answer the first question, and then any of the other panelists who want to answer the second. But you can comment on each other's, obviously. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. So, with regard to neorealism, at least the way Waltz has defined it or described it, it is perceived to be as a theory about great power politics, so to say, right? He's not in the theoretically, he is not discussing every power relationship out there, because he is considering great power politics in the absence of central authority, right? So if you're considering this kind of anarchy, the effect of anarchy, you are really talking about states at the very top of all sorts of hierarchies, right? Countries like Armenia certainly do not operate in a neo-realist sense. They do not operate under complete anarchy, right? We do exist under certain regional hierarchies. That, the regional hierarchies out there that are they're not purely in a neo-realist sense. We do not belong in that conversation. So my kind of idea of starting from neo-realism was more of starting to put a framework of what is going on in terms of power transitions globally, right? At that level, in terms of great power politics, as a background information, as an underlying framework for understanding how do we operate in this region, or what is happening exactly in this region. And in that context, so my kind of emphasis was on understanding that the region, this region in particular, but also in many other regions of the world, we are facing this sort of power competition between a hegemon and powers that are rising up to the hegemon. So I was more focused on that part. Certainly, I can see your kind of concern with the fact that Armenia being a small power is, and if you're thinking in terms of neo-realism, the opportunities for small powers are kind of limited in that sense. But the important thing though is that if we have a good framework to understand what is going on, right? At least when you are considering your foreign policy options, and for small states, just like medium states or large states, there are options out there in terms of forming alliances or trying to navigate between different powers. For instance, one of our neighbors, Turkey, has a history of very successfully navigating through the Russian and Western confrontation to the point of actually becoming a mediator between Russia and the West, although each of these powers have historically tried to wrap Turkey under their influence. So I think the core concept that I was trying to push forward was really to first start to understand what is happening, and rather not engage in a pessimistic thinking or in a very optimistic thinking that either Russia or the United States are so interested in coming and providing security for us, but really to starting as a starting point, taking that confrontation or that transformation of power as a source of this shift, right?
I don't want to put anyone on the spotlight, but Roman, if you want to take the second question in terms of the domestic sort of components, in terms of military and other elements in shape of our policy.
Well, in my view, and I'll pick up where Datevik left, in my view, these two questions are internally connected in a way that how to frame it. Of course, there is limited capacity, and overall we have some external limitations, right? Limitations of our own internal power and limitations that are imposed on us by regional and global players. But thinking that we have to stand against these all evils, so to say, or stand alone in this competition is sort of something that we hear very often, I think, in public discourse recently, especially after the war. But that's not entirely true, right? First of all, the power of alliances. No one has cancelled the power of alliances. Second, there are opportunities that are being created, including by our own initiation, participation, etc., that are being misused, being abandoned, and being underutilized. Sometimes, I think, also intentionally, or due to cognitive limitations, of which Varan was speaking earlier with reference to the 1993 UN Security Council resolutions. The cognitive limitation here being the following. We have all kind of almost celebrated a few days ago this preliminary order released by the International Court of Justice vis-a-vis the this requirement on Azerbaijan to open the corridor. And I think the reflections that we have seen in the intervening period, I think 2 days already, and the moves that we have also seen in these 2 days indicate that there is a certain fear to utilize this tool that has been created thanks to very hard work by very knowledgeable, talented, and devoted team of lawyers, including big shots, not only our own lawyers, homegrown sort of lawyers, but also big names such as Sean Murphy, to name one, from the United States. We see here the continuity of same or similar type of fears vis-a-vis the 1993 resolutions and vis-a-vis this order here, being completely not used, abandoned, and sort of disregarded almost, other than the PR kind of opportunity that it entails. That altogether this limits our relative power that we really have. In fact, and I think Arsen may pick up here, negotiating from human rights kind of perspective, negotiating as a victorious power that has certain lands under its control, etc., is a very, very difficult enterprise. Negotiating from the other perspective is much easier. Negotiating from a losing side is easier because you can build up on this human rights narrative that is less relevant today maybe than in early 2000s or in 1990s, but it's still relevant. It's not irrelevant, at least. Yeah.
Arsen or Varan, you want to add anything about these two questions, or should
Maybe
we?
just
Sure, go ahead, of course.
I would like to make a reference to this first period of our independence, and I mentioned about this tenure of the first president and the second president of Armenia. You all know this term complementarity, right? So that was the content of our foreign policy, although some people try to, of course, differentiate the foreign policy of the first president from the foreign policy of the second president, but there are only two differences there. The second president included the recognition of the Armenian genocide into the foreign policy agenda, and he had a different approach towards Nagorno-Karabakh conflict resolution. So in all other issues, it was the same policy of complementarity, and it worked pretty well. So our rejection of Cold War categories allowed us to develop very good relations with Russia. And at the same time, we remained also in strategic partnership with Russia as a member of CSTO. But at the same time, we developed pretty good relations with the United States and NATO. And Armenia, I think, was the only Soviet republic, the only country in the former Soviet Union area with such a multi-layered alliances. We also, at the same time, also had very good relations with Iran and Arab countries. So it means, as a small state in this region, it's possible to have flexible and very effective diplomacy. We used to have it for at least 18 or 20 years. And that diplomacy was bringing results, which is not the case today.
A rose in any other name is still a rose. I mean, what you were talking about, another late diplomat, Armen Karadzen, actually has discussed about the issue. Where did they come up with the term complementarism? But in reality, it was already there. It just wasn't given the name complementarism.
Right, and that was Armen's idea,
Yeah.
that term complementarity, and then we developed it together with Vartanov Skanyan, and this is how later it became the name of our foreign policy.
Let's get one more question, or quickly, if possible, two more questions, depending on the answers as well. Anyone? I know, I'm not ignoring you, Lago, but just giving the priority to students. Okay, there you go.
Shall I use this?
It's on, yeah, go on.
So you've briefly touched upon the issue of international recognition of Artsakh and combining the official statements from the high-ranking officials of both Armenia and Azerbaijan. We do have an impression that Armenia is going to recognize the Artsakh as part of Azerbaijan. And so, given this, in the worst-case scenario, if Armenia does that, what would be the role of Russian peacekeepers, and generally, what would be the role of Russia in this region? Thank you.
That's quite a specific question. Let me give the mic to Hagop as well to answer the question, ask his question, and then we'll let him.
First, thank you very much for this panel. It was such a great learning opportunity for me, and also, it was very, very informative. Thank you. So my question is philosophical, and it is, putting my social scientist lens. And I think I like how you framed the panel. That it is starting with, realism and trying to see neoliberalism as a lens in the panel. At some point, Asbed, you mentioned about, asking people to challenge the theoretical frame, etc. So I'm not here to challenge the theoretical frame. But I was wondering about your position and your assessment in relation to postmodernism as a theoretical framework and complexity theory in trying to understand the field, the potential of postmodernism, in trying to understand the field. I'm not a big fan of postmodernism, but I was just trying to see what would be the panelists' assessment on that, particularly in relation to truth and social reality, as Datevik was talking about, and Arsene, real politics. So, what would change there from a postmodern point of view? Thank you.
Was quite a loaded question, but anyone wants to take the first shot at postmodernism, postmodernism, or let's maybe let's do this. Let's go quickly. I'm going to start from this side to answer that question. Meanwhile, I will come back and answering Hagop's question. We can also have our concluding remarks. Arsene, you want to go with the
Russian.
Yeah. Peacemakers, is it?
That's a tough question, Mary. If I understood you correctly, if Armenian governments recognizes Artsakh as a part of Azerbaijan, what would Russian peacekeepers do? So far they have a mandate and they still have 2 or 3 years to stay, right? So it's for 5 years. I don't think even if that happens, although that's not going to happen very fast, because there is this process of negotiations, and those negotiations are very tough. And we have to also take into account many factors related to the population of Artsakh, right? As I said in my introductory remarks when I talked about the self-determination of Artsakh as a basis for its status, I also mentioned that we cannot buy those newly circulated formulations like freedom of Armenians for Artsakh or security. This freedom and security, everything should be, in my view, part of the status of Artsakh. I think Russia will do everything to extend those 5 years to stay more, because it somewhat ensures their military presence in Azerbaijan from their point of view. right? And they finally returned to Azerbaijan because, during the Russian Empire, Russia had everywhere. All this region was a part of the Russian Empire. Russian army was everywhere. And then during the Soviet Union, in all three republics, we had a Soviet army, right? So now we have in Armenia, Russian military base, right, and other Russian military presence. There is a Russian military presence in Georgia, in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and there is also Russian military presence in Azerbaijan. So the security of South Caucasus is very important for Russia because if they lose South Caucasus, the next comes North Caucasus. That's already Russian Federation. So that's why I think whatever this government does, it doesn't concern Russia. They will stay. And I'm sure they work also directly with the leadership of Artsakh to secure maybe many things. However, it's very important, to engage Artsakh and the issue of self-determination. If this government doesn't do it, I think Armenian diaspora and all Armenians and organizations here in Armenia should think about the self-determination of Artsakh and do everything what they can do.
Dear Mary, if that happens, we have to change our entire. We have to change our Declaration of Independence. We have to change our constitutions. In that case, we'll be talking about the fourth republic of this country. Go and read our Declaration of Independence in 1990. Article. So it's all about Nagorno-Karabakh. The first preamble is about that. Declaration, our constitution, the preamble is about Artsakh, it's about Nagorno-Karabakh. If that happens, then it's about a completely different beginning. Is Armenian political, intellectual, humanitarian thought ready for this? No. Go and do any public opinion survey. Not a single opinion survey supports that kind of outcome. So therefore, what to do is just to thank you.
On cue.
And what do we have to do? And hear me now, to learn from Azerbaijan now. It's now our turn to learn from Azerbaijan. This may sound as shocking, but the learning curve, not the Armenophobic part, but how they have weaponized how they have weaponized losing parts of their Soviet territory as a tool to consolidate national objectives. Here, there were many inhumane ways that they have achieved their objectives. But the kind of generation that went and took Shushi, yes, they were raised by anti-Armenian sentiments. They were taught in the schools that Armenians are our enemies. In their kindergartens, they were taught to hate Armenians. That was not what I'm suggesting. But the way they have consolidated the entire Azerbaijani resources to take back Karabakh and Shushi. Why they have stopped at Shushi? Shushi was more than a city for them. But it was not like that. But they have created that image out of nowhere. I mean, for them, the history starts in 1750s. They have some methodological, some myth related to the origins of Shushi. But that's just for historians, just a matter of love. There is nothing serious about this. So therefore, are we ready for this? You as a young generation ready? I don't know how many of you have read Declaration of Independence of the political foundation documents of this country. But think about this. When you go read that document, this is where all our systems in the republic was founded upon. Are we ready to embrace a new Declaration of Independence? What is it going to be about? Sorry.
Maybe to just say, would you be able to take on, if I were to ask you about Havok's question, so that we can wrap up?
Yeah, but I did really want to say that I cannot agree more with Donna. That's such an agreement would certainly undermine our understanding of our own, self-identity. It does seem to be really a very important moment in our consciousness and self-identity to just somehow consider as part of an international agreement. We're just giving up on something that helped redefine or define our identity in the past 30 years or so. I think that is a very important point. And I understand that whatever the content of the agreement is, which I certainly have no information about, but the other part of it is, of course, the rights and the defense of Arab Armenians. So there's probably some points about it that are subject to contention there, and perhaps to some extent the role of the Russian presence is connected to that. Would probably be still linked to that role as a protector of the Armenian population. And with regard to more philosophical questions, and I think you shouldn't be reserved on raising questions that are challenging the dominant paradigm. I think that has been done very, or if not successfully, at least very consistently throughout the past several decades. And in a more global, let's say, meta-theoretical level, right, the post-positivism, I think, has come to challenge very powerfully the kind of materialistic determinism of positivism, and also our ability to conduct the kind of research based on evidence as other physical sciences are conducting, and I do tend to think that there is a lot of learning, that there's a lot of information accumulated there that is worth considering. I don't think it's a black and white issue. I think certainly there are meeting points and not necessarily, in conflict. One of my favorite authors, Hannah Arendt, she very, I think, effectively stated that it is impossible to identify irregularities in social sciences the way we do in natural sciences, because regularities, if they are there, that means we ourselves created those regularities. So we're just describing them rather than uncovering or unearthing those regularities. So I think that is a very powerful way to criticize theories like neorealism, which on the other hand, however, I think Walter is by background a mathematician and has looked across a history from 5th century BC, from the Peloponnesian War, and has really, it seems like he has uncovered some sort of a regularity that is in place, to which we are kind of clinging onto in the international relations field, because that's kind of a small piece of theory that we do have. So I do think that there is a lot of important criticism that comes from the critical school, but also there's reason why we kind of still value what we have in the positivist tradition, and at the same time I think there are also questions within the critical school. So let's say if we go back to
try to wrap up. I think we're past. Sorry.
All right.
I know we can go on. That's the nature of postmodernism.
Yes. I had in mind Robert Cox, who actually defined quite a bit of the constructivist and other traditions in the post-positivist theory. And he was very, I think, he's remains one of the, I think, most effective critical thinkers. So, for instance, his idea of world order, not necessarily just defined by material conditions, but material plus the ideas or ideologies plus the institutions, and kind of shaping the world order and creating opportunity of change.
We're really running out of time. Please wrap up. Because we need to vacate the room.
Right. I just wanted to say he himself was rather critical, though, but about the possibility of change or the direction of change, or our ability to actually describe, how that change is going to happen. So I think there's quite a bit of thinking that still is pending, and there's some food for thought and that contradiction. That answers your question or not?
30 seconds for Gerard, if I may, just a small comment, and I would like to give the final word to, final comment to Oban. It was his idea, by the way, to put together this event.
Okay, thank you for this event. I'll try to put it short. I wanted to make a comment on the Cold War logic that was discussed here. I think it's extremely important thing. It also continues the logic that was previously, that there was a first world, we were the second world, and then there was a third world, and now we still perceive ourselves as a second world representatives, while the outer world does not think so. This is one issue, and this East vs West issue is essentially the around the global North issue, while we are discussing the declining power, both demographically and economically, and quick declining powers, both West and Russia, which is extremely important also. I'm afraid that the roots of this policy are not only those which have been discussed, but also it has racist roots, because also called Uzbekner, who are around in the south, and these are growing countries, bigger countries. I don't know, Vietnam has surpassed 100 million people, and so on. Economization is also a good concept, but it's also important how do we perceive it, because we might perceive that, okay, I don't know, Ireland is important, or maybe still Vietnam. And Cold War logic also limits the number of foreign partners. We should select this or that. Instead, I think we should go beyond and build a difficult architecture. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ovan's final sort of.
Just to thank everyone for participating and for these good questions. 5, maybe 6 sentences.
Oh,
okay.
I had a heart attack.
No. Well, I have a class in 15,
5, 6 seconds.
and I want my students to be on time, and I also want to be on time. Post-positivism, post. Well, the short assessment of what we are observing is probably that the truth is dead. There's no more truth. And this is being very heavily utilized by politicians who are taking advantage of it. The truth has been killed also by people so eloquently explained by Dunning and Kruger. In this situation, there is this question if public opinion matters, and if the above is true, shall public opinion matter, right? Maybe it shall not. But from these philosophical questions, the more practical kind of aspects that are kind of worrisome in our times, also raised by some of the students here, is this treaty, whether this agreement will be signed, etc. We don't know, but if we can draw parallels, probably my parallel will be Anwar Sadat. That guy was sure that he is a messiah. He was a messianic politician. That is the core reason why he traveled to speak before the Knesset. And I'm kind of safely making this argument, knowing that I'm the last speaker and Farah will not challenge me. But that was exactly the reason that he traveled there. His upbringing is maybe a good reference here, which leads me to argue that such agreement that you mentioned can be signed, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, maybe in the near future. We don't know that. We certainly do not know, as Atavik mentioned a few times, what is being negotiated, what is being discussed, what is being decided within this black box. But we know that politicians that have this messianic self-image or conceptual approach of messianism certainly do things that other mainstream politicians would never do. And our goal today was to offer these analytical frameworks for ourselves to be thinking, to be self-reflective, and also for the audience.
He might not challenge you here, but I'm sure he's going to challenge you either in the court or whatnot. One final thing, there's always a choice. People who say we don't have any options or we don't have any choices, that is BS. One of the key elements when I was, again, one of my dissertation advisors gave me is that when small countries are faced with two choices, that none of them are great, they strive to create alternative choices. It's just that sometimes we're lazy, either as humans or as collectives, to find out and make the effort of finding the third least bad choice. So always keep that in mind. Remember public service, remember diplomacy, remember to, for undergrads, apply to international relations, diplomacy and public affairs, public service. And for those of you who have classes, I'm sorry. Not with Hovanes, it's just Friday night class. I must be brutal. It was or they didn't have a choice. and also, you guys have a wonderful weekend for those of you, and thank you for coming.